traditional birth attendants might do with the forceps in damaging the skulls of the babies. And so ultimately on that one the doctors won, and there are no forceps in any of the kits of the traditional birth attendants. That wasn't based on any evidence, it was just based on the certainty of medical knowledge that traditional birth attendants couldn't be trusted with forceps. Of course, they can buy them in a drugstore if they want them bad enough, and some did, our study found. In any event, there's an example of an indigenous channel. It also represents, of course, a kind of indigenous knowledge. It also represents a kind of merger of the indigenous channel and knowledge with modern knowledge. And there were a lot of controversies, the forceps controversy just being one of them. But our evaluation studies showed that there was a lot of benefit in terms of babies not dying at birth and mothers living who otherwise probably would not have. So it seems to be a mild success. That's quite a change from the Dutch colonial policy in Indonesia when the Dutch government was there of eliminating the dukuns. The American government had the same policy and used the same words, actually, eliminate the traditional birth attendants in the Philippines when we had something to say about the government of the Philippines. So we've come a long way. Some other examples of indigenous channels, just to move along, are, for instance, in sudden changes in government, one way or the other, changes in government, the role that sort of the little media and the traditional media play. Begin with sort of a surprising thing. At the time of the fall of the Shah, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Inayatollah Khomeini was organizing street demonstrations in Tehran of up to 3 million people. Now, if you've ever tried to organize Visha at Iowa State, you can imagine that getting 3 million people in orderly processions, these were very orderly, very disciplined street demonstrations. And the Inayatollah was living in the south of France, in the Riviera at this time. He had moved there, and this is a clue as to how he did it, from Saudi Arabia because he could have direct dial telephone service to his followers in Iran. Direct dial is very important if you have a Shah and a Secret Service trying to keep people from listening to their leader who has been exiled to outside the country. Then the message, it was a daily message, was reproduced by sound audio cassettes in the bazaars and by Xeroxing. Modern technologies, but sort of little ones. So while the Shah ruled the airwaves with his satellites and his television system and with his secret police, the Inayatollah's followers were reproducing his message, and it was reaching millions of people each day by these sort of subterranean, underground, very illicit and somewhat indigenous kinds of communication. An Iranian scholar who studied this phenomena, Majid Tehranian, a friend of a number of us in this room, wrote an article a few years back about this phenomena, and he called it something like democracy over autocracy via Xeroxy, something like this. Similarly, today there's a study underway by Steve Wiley, a young scholar named Steve Wiley at the University of Texas, who is studying the change in government in Chile in recent years, where President Pinochet, who had been elected for life in a referendum held back in 1980, decided to restore popularly elected government to his country. General Pinochet, a military dictator, controlled the television system, the radio system, and the press, but he didn't control things like graffiti messages on walls, notes, audio tapes, and the other means of communication that were used to bring about a fairly peaceful change in government. I think it's a noteworthy case. Well, now, finally, a bit about the Laboratory for Development Communication. This is a recent organization begun this year at my university, the University of Southern California. Steve Lansing is the director of the Laboratory for Development Communication. He is also the chair of anthropology and is a speaker with the Bali Project, about the Bali Project later this evening. He probably won't say much about the laboratory, so I'm going to take a minute to do that before I stop. Also involved in the laboratory is, in addition to Steve and I, is a scholar named Peter Lyman, a political scientist, a computer whiz, who is the director of the Center for Scholarly Technology on our campus. He having close relationships with the computer industry, and he's in essence in charge of introducing new technology onto our campus. Thierry Bardini, our noon speaker, also is involved, and other scholars in the film school, in demography, and in other aspects of our university that deal with development. We do not have a College of Agriculture, unfortunately, so we don't have any agriculturalists other than somebody with a large garden. In any event, this is an interdisciplinary approach to development communication. We think that makes sense. We see ourselves as hopefully becoming a node in a worldwide network of centers devoted to scholarly approaches to development communication. One of them, of course, being CCARD, another one being Cultural Survival, CS, an organization that's headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard. Its purpose is to study and preserve and film indigenous cultures such as rainforest tribes in Brazil and in Central America and so on. They create films and videos as a way of preserving what it aims would be called indigenous knowledge. We also are forming a link with the Drylands Research Center at the University of Arizona in Tucson, as it's called in Spanish, and others yet to come, which will certainly be some of them outside of the United States. The purpose of our little laboratory is to try to push back the frontiers of the application of communication technologies to development. We think it represents, the new technologies represent a set of special problems. I've tried to touch on some of those, and some special opportunities, both in the U.S. and in other nations. So we hope that our studies will concern the U.S. domestic development programs and problems, as well as those overseas. Three of the assumptions of our work. One is that, I guess I've already said it, that movement in development communication is centered, or can be centered around communication technology. Technologies, they provide the opportunities of today. Secondly, that how these technologies are used, to what purpose, with what content that they carry, how they're organized, how they're embedded, in what are they embedded, who owns and controls them, and to whose benefit. All these are issues that mainly determine their effectiveness, rather than the technologies themselves. This is, of course, a social constructionist viewpoint. And then thirdly, a third assumption is that communication technologies can empower local people. They can allow them to speak to those who are in power, but that process, for it to happen, usually at least, needs some kind of external assistance. Without that, it usually doesn't happen. I want to close with three questions that I think are with us, and which I think are crucial to be resolved. I'm not implying that we have the answers. I think we don't. I don't, at least. But I think there are three important areas for us to work toward solving, to answering. So in close, let me mention these three questions before the House, let's say. One of them is how can communication expertise assist local people with certain communication technologies, example video, to empower while not just extracting knowledge for abstract scholarly purposes. In other words, how can we use these new technologies to bring about actual development for the benefit of the people who are involved without just making it a sterile, abstract, academic, scholarly activity. That would not be enough. Second question is, how can indigenous knowledge be made, of all kinds, be made visible to technologists so that it can be utilized more effectively in development programs? The sort of amazing thing to me and to all of us, I think, who work in this area is how strong the resistance to the indigenous knowledge perspective is, especially on the part of experts who are trained in technological fields. It makes the training makes them have a kind of trained incapacity. It makes it difficult, especially difficult for them to see the indigenous knowledge that, whether they like it or not, they are related to. And then thirdly, how do we bring about development and social change in a way that doesn't widen socioeconomic and gender inequalities, rather in ways that seek to close those inequalities among the people for which development programs are intended. Thank you very much. Knowing this is Ames, probably there are.
Yeah, you think so? Questions? Yes.
Yes, sir.
How do you differentiate between the notion of development communication and development support communication?
This is a question, I'll repeat it for anyone who might not have heard it. How do we distinguish between development communication and development support communication? This is a very important question. It's raised by two of our friends who have driven from Iowa City today in order to be here with us this afternoon. And they are from a development support communication center. Am I right about that, in Iowa U? At the University of Iowa?
No, I have shifted my track.
Okay, well, anyway, it's a very good question whether I got your identification correct or not. I didn't say anything about development support communication. It's usually taken to be a smaller Venn diagram than development communication, and it is development in support of, it's communication, sorry, in support of a development program. So let's say we've got a tsetse fly eradication program in a country, seldom can that program be effective, even though it may centrally involve entomologists, unless it also has a communication component. So this is sort of the usual, at least, definition of development support communication. I didn't say anything about that per se, but I certainly think it lies at the heart of development communication. It is, in fact, where most of the movement, the action today is. There is, however, a contrasting point of view, which I should also mention so that you understand it. And this is a viewpoint being expressed by a few people in a few places, in the World Bank, for instance, and a few other places, by people who say, maybe for too long we have limited the work we have done in development communication to mainly development support communication. And maybe we don't need to think of of communication as just a part of other development programs, but maybe we also ought to think of it as a development program in itself. In other words, to try to make cheaper, more available, more widely used, more rich channels of communication available to audiences in countries for them to use as they see fit. Maybe that is a worthy goal of communication in and of itself. So I detect this slight rise of that isn't in opposition necessarily of development support communication. It just says there is also a function of development communication per se in and of itself. But do you at least see the difference? Everybody see the difference between development support communication? Okay, you probably use these terms, and they're very important ones. And one of the sharpenings of our thinking about development communication happened mainly during the 70s and 80s, I think, with a focus on development support communication. It's a very important sub-movement in and of itself. Okay, other questions? We'll talk some more later after the show before Des Moines Airport. Are there any other questions about any of this fast clip that we have taken over the world?
Okay, well, seeing none, we'll close then. Dr. Rogers, thank you very much for your time.